Americans are not going to accept the outcome of the election, but rather that a few are going to raise up against our armed forces or against our military or against our police or even against our candidates and incite violence. And that's really scary.
Well, again, their refusal to accept cold, hard facts. That's what is so utterly perplexing and frustrating to, I think, a lot of people. And when you try to present that, then the answer is, well, let's just attack or lash out at these people. And I got to step back from this and look at, okay, what created this? Why do people have such strong beliefs this way?
Part of it is because their ego doesn't accept the fact that the outcome of the elections is going to be based on most of what those that vote believe, and that they don't believe exactly what these folks are holding to be true. And if you're sitting on one end of the spectrum and you think that your person is going to be the best president ever, and you realize that there is a majority of those that vote that disagree with you, there are individuals that believe that they will be right all the way up to prison. And unfortunately, that's what's going to happen on November 9th, is that we're going to have, I believe, some isolated cases of individuals that simply refuse to accept the outcome of this election one way or another.
That's what kind of led to the thinking of the Edward R. Murrow building bombing, or the Murrow building, not the Edward, but in Oklahoma City, that kind of thinking. And I really worry about some of these extremist groups that we have here in this country that are homegrown. And you look at this group of individuals in Kansas City that were going to blow up a hotel because it housed a lot of Somalis that were working in a Tyson Foods plant near that city in that area, and they were upset because they were Muslim.
Right, and then you also have people that for the past 2 years have had an emotional reaction to a lot of the police shootings that have taken place throughout the country, whether legitimate or illegitimately. And by virtue of that, you have people that are questioning the very legitimacy of our government, the very legitimacy of our Constitution. Now you have a political candidate that is at least raising the possibility, or perhaps in his mind the fact, that the elections are going to be rigged. And so by virtue of that, now you have the inspiration across the board that their suspicion that somehow those individuals that hold authority and their role of authority are in fact corrupt, and they are in fact following a certain candidate more than another. That's what really worries me, is that this is the last layer on the cake that some of these individuals needed in order for their cause to be legitimate.
Alex Del Carmen is with us. He heads up the School of Criminology, Criminal Justice, and Strategic Studies at Tarleton State University. Our guest here on WCCO Radio. I'm Moose Miller, sitting in tonight for Jordana Green. I don't know if you caught the video here in Edina of the undercover police officer that stopped a young man, African-American young man, that was walking in the street to get around a construction area on a sidewalk. But, that escalated and spun up and became a viral video. And now the Edina Police Department is saying it's reviewing its policy of how it kind of interacts with individuals in that instance. But every time you turn around, we've got more and more instances where, stuff is caught on video. And I guess my point is, if you don't see the video leading up to the point of where police become involved, we don't have 100% full context of everything, do we?
Right. And in addition to that, keep in mind that there are 1 million police officers in the streets of the United States on a daily basis, and most of those interactions we never hear or about them or we see them on television. And so by virtue of that, that's not to say that in some of these cases police officers shouldn't have done better, and in fact some of them may have even violated the law, and they should be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. But having said that, it's very difficult for the public to formulate opinions on 5 seconds worth of video when they lack context, and the video oftentimes doesn't capture the essence of what really happened. And so by virtue of that, I would caution all of your listeners tonight that when you do watch something, always require and demand that all of the information is provided before opinions are formulated.
Well, we've got the Philando Castile shooting here in St. Anthony, Minnesota, a suburb of the Twin Cities that, is still working its way through the legal process. And I think, more has yet to come out on that situation.
Right. And part of the problem is that when a police department, has to, by law, release a video, oftentimes they have to withhold 2/3 of the pieces of information that are part of the case because of the fact that it is an ongoing investigation. So from a PR perspective, the police department sets itself up to almost lose the battle of credibility before the public, even though there may be information in the investigation that may actually exculpate the police department. And sadly, they have to refrain from releasing that for legal reasons. And unfortunately, in the eyes of everyone else, they have to sit back and simply say, we can only release that 1% of the information that we have until a later point, which is typically a year, sometimes 2 years, when the passions have died down, people have forgotten about the case, and then at that point they realize that, there's more to the case in the first place.
Alex, when we come back here, maybe you can shed some light on some methods or approaches to de-escalating part of this electorate that, may not like the outcome of this election in light of the fact that, there is no rigging of the vote. And how do we go about doing that? How do you go about convincing people that just seem beyond facts and reason? Our guest, Alex Del Carmen, heading up the School of Criminology, Criminal Justice, and Strategic Studies at Tarleton State University in Fort Worth, Texas. Moose Miller sitting in tonight for Jordana Green here on 830 WCCO. Our guest, Alex Del Carmen, heads up the School of Criminology, Criminal Justice, and Strategic Studies at Tarleton State University in Fort Worth, Texas. Donald Trump has really been ratcheting up the election is rigged rhetoric and that the vote is rigged. And yet every legitimate source that you look at concerning that points to there's just no way that is even possible. How do you go about, Alex, convincing people that don't want to be convinced, that are just burned in their brains that, the fix is in?
Well, first of all, I think we need to hold our politicians accountable, right? So we need to make sure that if it's illegal for most of us to walk into a movie theater and scream fire when there is no fire, I think we need to make sure that our politicians are held accountable, that whenever they raise questions that are completely unfounded, that will potentially inspire people to commit violence, that we should hold them accountable for that. Secondly, I always tell people to try to, in many ways, put this in context, right? And I hate to say this, but it's somewhat humorous, but it is true. It's like electing a bad president or a bad congressman or woman is in many ways like getting a bad haircut. All you got to do is wait for it to grow, and then you can get a cut again. We have a great democracy, right? So every 4 years, we're going to be electing a new president. And so if we don't get it right this time around, we're going to have 4 years later to get it right. And at the end of the day, no person, whether man or woman, whether white or black or Hispanic, is ever going to end the Constitution of the United States. And we need to make sure that we put that in context and we understand that our Constitution has already been tested for over 200 years. It will continue to be tested, but it will supersede the bad individual that we may or may not elect to office. And so as frustrated as people may be, remember that 4 years later, the Constitution will allow us to vote again against that person that we may not like in the first place.
Well, I'll tell you what, though, I think a lot of us are like, really, do we even have 4 years? A lot of damage can be done in 4 years.
Well, a lot of damage can be done in 4 years, but the Constitution isn't going to end and the country isn't going to stop to exist. I mean, in the 200 plus years that we've had a government in our United States, we've had great presidents and we've had awful presidents. And the damage that has been done by those individuals that have not been ideal, has been, in many ways repaired and redone by presidents that are in place too. And remember too, we also have a Congress. We also have a democratic process where presidents have limitations as to what they can do. So although the election is important and who we put in office is crucial, at the same time, at the end of the day, the disappointment when he sits in, he has to actually settle with the understanding and the perspective that we have a Constitution that will supersede a bad election.
I'm reading a story here tonight. Alan Raymond, who wrote the book on rigging elections, literally wrote How to Rig an Election: Confessions of a Republican Operative, and talks about some of the dirty tricks that were employed. For example, in the 2002 New Hampshire Senate election, he actually went to prison for 3 months for what he did there. But he points out that what Donald Trump is alleging, it just isn't possible. It isn't, true. And it's also just such a blanket generic statement. There is nothing to really run down and fact check.
Right. So if you think about the word rigged, right? So what exactly does that mean today? In the year 2016, most of us have a cell phone. Most of us, when we go vote, we're going to be outside the voting places to make sure that if somebody comes in with a sign or tries to inspire somebody to violate the voting patterns, we're going to be out there making sure that doesn't happen. People are going to be telling on each other. There's technology, social media that will facilitate that information to be wired all around the world. But the threat is bigger in the sense that we may have foreign countries that may try to hack into systems in order to be able to rig those machines. Now, that is in fact a threat, and the FBI has said so. But that's not necessarily looking for one political candidate over another. That is the cyber threat that we are under constantly 24/7 that many of us in the United States completely ignore. But having said that, if he's trying to say that there are people that are going to simply affect the outcome of the election based on what they do locally, there is simply no proof of that at all.
Well, it's probably one of the craziest presidential elections I've ever seen, and I voted and participated in the 2000 election in Palm Beach County, Florida, back in 2000, and I thought that'll be the craziest presidential election I'm ever involved in. No, this one is shaping up to probably be the craziest. I don't know about you.
No, I agree, and of course remember that the 2000 election, we thought it was crazy mostly afterwards. After that first Tuesday in November when we all voted.
Yeah.
And, of course, the Florida elections, came up in the air as CNN and other news sources, simply calling it for one candidate 1 minute and another the next. But now it seems to me that what's crazier about this election is that it's leading up to the election day. It's when we're actually raising up our arms in the air and saying this is insane. And so we haven't even gotten to that point yet. And I sometimes, fear what's going to happen if it is, in fact, a close election, and we're going to get caught up between lawyers and people inciting violence to one another. Imagine the possibility that on November 8th in the evening, we still don't know who the president of the United States is going to be.
Yeah, for sure. Alex, thank you so much for joining us here on WCCO tonight.
Thanks for having me.
Straight ahead here, we'll check the WCCO weather forecast and see if